Hello and welcome to a special Bogota-based episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those with some connection to Latin America. This episode is brought to you by LATAM List, a daily English language news source that covers Latin American tech news. If you like this podcast, I bet you'll like LATAM List. My guest today is Brian York, co-founder of Liftit, a Bogota-based last-mile delivery business for trucks that has operations in all major markets in Latin America. Brian is an entrepreneur who has truly crossed borders, literally and figuratively. He was born in Colombia and then adopted by a US-based family and grew up south of Boston. He always knew he wanted to be an entrepreneur and always knew he wanted to explore his Colombian roots. He started his first business while in high school, then worked as an accountant after graduating from university, before embarking on his entrepreneurial career again. He went on to start multiple businesses in Silicon Valley, some of which failed and some of which were successful and later acquired. We cover his lessons learned from jumping from a traditional job to a startup, what he learned from failure, his advice for raising venture capital, and then his decision to both raise a small fund to invest in early stage companies in Silicon Valley and other places, and to move back to Colombia to find his birth family and start a business with two Colombian co-founders. Brian is a wealth of expertise both in the US and in Colombia and is paving the way forward for more Latin American entrepreneurs. I really hope you enjoy my conversation with Brian York. Hey Brian, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Thanks for having me, Nate.
So where are we in the world today?
We are at headquarters in Bogota, Colombia.
Awesome. And what are you working on?
Liftit is focused on logistics in Latin America, specifically doing last mile trucking.
Awesome. And how long have you been doing it? And can you give me some idea of the size of the business today?
Yeah, we just crossed our 2-year anniversary. And we are headquartered here. We have about 150 employees here. And are also doing operations in all the other major cities in Latin America.
Awesome. So I'll jump in more and dig in on the business in a little bit here, but I wanted to jump back first and talk about you. So where are you from originally?
So I have a pretty unique story. So I was actually born here in Bogota, and I was adopted as a baby. So 2 weeks old, I went from the orphanage here to growing up in Boston, Massachusetts. And my whole life, I've always had a calling to come back to my roots, learn about the culture, learn about the language, and understand about the city where I was born. And so, that's part of the reason why we started Liftit in Bogota, was basically primarily an excuse to come back home. We get really fortunate with the business itself, and it's growing really good and doing well, but that was my first instinct was to come back home.
And when did you first come back to Colombia?
I had done a quick trip in 2009 just to come back for the first time. But it was 2015 where I had some availability in my schedule to start coming back and going to the orphanage, getting my records. And I actually tried to start looking for my biological family myself. I just did find my biological family recently in the middle of last year, but towards the end I had to, because of my language barrier and the lack of information, I ended up hiring a private investigator to help me find my family, who I've been reunited with, and actually now my brother Alex, who's in Medellin, works for Liftit.
Amazing. That's an amazing story.
Yeah, thank you.
That's really cool. So when you were growing up in the U.S., did you know that you were from Colombia and have the whole story, or was it something that you found out later?
Yeah, no. I mean, ever since my memory goes back, I can remember my mother telling me about my history, and it was really obvious. I grew up in a small town south of Boston called Norwell. It's about 20 minutes south of the city, and it's basically 100% white. And so I was the only brown kid there, and I stood out like a sore thumb. But I was fortunate because the town was really good town, really well educated, and so I was never really discriminated on or anything. I was always felt welcome, even though I was the only brown kid in town.
So growing up, did you always know you were going to be an entrepreneur, or was that something that came later?
I did. I've had an interesting journey of being an entrepreneur and then jumping into corporate and then coming back into entrepreneurship. So when I was in high school, I created a business with landscaping. And so I did lawn mowing and cutting the grass, weed whacking, cutting shrubs. And I did that all through high school and grew the business locally. And always knew that I wanted to develop my own business and be in control of the business. And so after college, I actually ended up in California, in Los Angeles, and started my career off as an accountant. And a lot of that was because I was, you're influenced, especially in the area I grew up and, the family I grew up with. You're influenced to, get a job right at a school, suit and tie, work for a bank, work for a corporation. That's why you go to college. And so I followed that path, and I ended up at a CPA firm in Los Angeles right out of college. And it was good. It provided me a lot of fundamentals of what it's like to work for a big corporation and to learn accounting and how to do record keeping. But I always knew in my heart I didn't belong behind a desk. I didn't belong having to be a 9-to-5 wearing a suit and tie every day, and I always felt uncomfortable with it. In 2007, I actually went from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and I did that move for a couple of reasons, but one in particular was to start my own company again. And I had been talking to a lot of venture capitalists raising their first venture fund, it was like a $25 to $100 million fund. And in their first conversations, they were asking like where to set up the bank, how to take care of taxation, how to set up their back office. And I saw these funds spending a lot of money hiring a CFO, a controller, software, staff accountants. And so I relocated to San Francisco because I saw, obviously, in the US, that's where a lot of the venture capital funds are. And I offered a service. It was an on-demand accounting service specifically for venture capital funds. So they didn't have to expense all of this from their management company, but instead, sort of on demand, outsourced the back office to me and one friend in the beginning. But we grew that company from 2007 to 2010, and now that company is still around and doing really well. But that I had stayed with that company for the first few years before pivoting my career and jumping into tech entrepreneurship. But in that experience, allowed me to see what these venture capital funds were investing into. So my very last customer or client was Chris Sacca with Lowercase Ventures, and I was Chris's CFO. And so if you read Lowercase Ventures' first limited partner letter he sent to all his LPs, he says, I wouldn't be here unless it was for 3 people, my COO, my lawyers, and my Brian New York, my accountant. And now that I'm a tech entrepreneur myself, I look back at that letter, I'm like, man, I can't believe I was actually a part of that, sitting around the table when Chris was putting the first checks into Instagram and Uber and creating the fund, which eventually just bought up a bunch of Twitter secondaries. And so at first I was the accountant around the table, but I was young enough, and at the time I was 28, 29 in San Francisco, where I could see what was happening in San Francisco around tech, and I had the idea to get away from behind the desk as an accountant and to jump into tech entrepreneurship with absolutely having no previous experience in there.
And what was that one thing that was the push or the inflection point which was like, I'm ready to do this, now's my time?
Well, I think it was my age, and I was just bored of sitting behind the desk and being like the accountant and doing a service business, whether you're doing accountancy or something else. You're always kind of at the whim of your client. Like, where are my financial statements? Like, how come this doesn't reconcile? And I had, at that time in my career and my life, I just didn't see myself sitting behind a desk number crunching the rest of my life.
And how did you pick the idea to work on?
So in college, I had played soccer, and all my life I had played sports. My very first angel investment, which I lost all the money there, but it was a sports startup in Boston, and it was my college roommate, and I didn't even have any money at the time. I cash advanced some some money from a credit card, and I angel invested into this company. And it was a company around sports and sports management ship that eventually ran out of money. And so I had angel invested in the space. I had always been a part of sports, and at that time in the Bay Area, there was a lot of social applications. And so, and for me, it was like, okay, I have the experience and the enthusiasm around sports, and I want to create the next Facebook for sports fans. And so that's what I jumped into, creating a business that was going to connect sports fans in their among their interests with sports.
Did you have any co-founders?
No, at the time it was just myself.
And what were your first couple of steps when you started that business?
So, your typical first-time entrepreneur mistakes. My friends wanted to join the business. My brother wanted to join the business. So anyone that had interest, like, come join. Like, this is a startup. I haven't raised any money, but the next day I had 15 people working for me, and everyone was like wanted to be founders and part of this idea. So I had no filter on who actually was going to start the business with me. And that was one of the first mistakes I had.
And so what happened with that business?
So it took me 14 months to fundraise, and I've always been really persistent with fundraising. And that was kind of my first tell that I was going to be somewhat pretty good at fundraising, where I had no idea what tech entrepreneurship was or how to run a tech company. But on day one, I started to ask friends and family and then get connected to local investors in San Francisco and start to fundraise. And in the beginning, I didn't have a presentation, a business plan, any technology. I just went out to start to talk to investors to see if they wanted to invest in my idea. And I was persistent enough, and then I slowly got better as an entrepreneur, where I finally got my first angel checks 14 months later.
Wow. And how much did you end up raising?
And then, I continued to get a little bit better as an entrepreneur slowly but surely, and beginning to end, we raised about $3 million for that company. And that was my first failure as an entrepreneur as well. That business didn't have a business model. It was your typical social application, where I had just hoped to get millions of sports fans onto my platform and chatting with each other and sharing photos. So at the end of the day, unfortunately, not even the code base was worth getting acquired, and had to shut the company down because we ran out of money, no business model. And after 3 years, had nothing to show for it. But I definitely learned a lot in the process.
One of the things that people talk about in Latin America are companies that raise money and then end up being zombie companies.
Yes.
That's more possible in Latin America than in the Bay Area because cost of living are less. There's, I think, probably more of a fear of failure. Can you talk about how you thought about shutting it down and what advice you would give to people who maybe are in zombie company situations in LATAM?
Super, super good question. And I think it doesn't matter if you're in Latin America or the Bay Area. I think it's a mixture of things. One, it was my first company. I couldn't imagine, I was embarrassed. I saw the writing on the wall after 2 years, and I kept it alive for another year. Basically running out of money, putting my own money. I continued to find, whether it's through debt or more friends and family, I found ways to keep the lights on with small checks. When it was clear the business should have just been shut down, and I should have just moved on to the next opportunity. But if you look at my situation, I was just embarrassed to say, hey, I failed. It was my baby. It was my idea. I had to make it work. And so for those last 12 months, I just dragged my heels and tried to make anything work when it was super obvious that this business was going nowhere.
What other lessons did you learn from that company?
A lot. So it took me a long time to make decisions. And some of that is because I didn't have any experience to leverage. And so, as I've done more startups, I've always tried to get better at this. Even when I don't necessarily have like the correct answer around what was trying to be achieved, you try to make a quick decision and push the company forward. And that was a big lesson learned for my first company. I tried to get too involved in things that I'm just not good at in this first company. So I used to spend a lot of time trying to make product decisions where I'm absolutely horrible. I shouldn't be involved in that process as well. So I tried to micromanage every situation. I didn't really give people around me the availability to make their own decisions and to allow their decisions to be put on the table, because I was too hands-on into the business. And then bringing it back to the point I already made, just like in the beginning, just hiring anybody, friends, family, friends of friends. And if you looked at that starting team, really my brother, at the time, he wasn't that talented, and he's still in tech, and he's super talented now because he learned from that experience and moved on. But even then, like we all had no idea what we were doing, and no one had any previous startup experience, and so that was like fundamentally a big area and a big error in the beginning of the company.
Yeah, I think the point about making decisions is really, really important. And from what we've seen from our portfolio is the best entrepreneurs are making decisions fast, and then if it doesn't work, they'll make another decision to change it.
Yes.
There's very, very few decisions that are company killers. Everything else you should just be trying to make them as quick as possible instead of agonizing for a couple of weeks or a month on something.
Exactly.
And so once the company shut down, what did you do next?
So I went on and I did two more startups in San Francisco, and I actually also was one of the fortunate entrepreneurs to raise a small seed fund, which had 18 limited partners which has 18 limited partners who are also my investors in my operating companies. So it was a kind of a scout fund / just a side venture fund that I was allowed to make angel investments from. My next two startups were enterprise software companies. The second startup was more opportunistic, where I had been friends with the head of mobile at Caesars Corporation, the casino out in Vegas, and he let me know that he was having trouble developing mobile apps for the casino, specifically around the back-end integration. So me and by that time I had a technical partner. We convinced him that we were going to build a back-end for Caesars Casino to allow their 10 companies that they were working with all throughout the United States, which were mobile designers and mobile developers for the front end, for them to integrate with the back end. And so we did it specifically for Caesars, and then we productized that product and eventually sold it to other companies. The third business was trying to solve my own problem. One of the biggest problems I have as an entrepreneur is I'm non-technical. So by the third business, I had experienced a lot of pain around spending a lot of money and time trying to understand what's happening with engineering. And so this third business basically gave, starting with myself, visibility of what's happening with the quality of the code with the developers. And so, as developers committed code, it would analyze whether, out of this code commit, 80% is good code, 20% is bad code. And we eventually basically measured technical debt for businesses and then scaled it up into selling that to a B2B technical debt measurement platform.
Interesting. And how did you raise money for that business?
Yeah, all three businesses we've raised money for.
And looking at how you raised money from, skip the current business for now, but how did that evolution go of how you raised, what that looked like, and who you raised from?
So with every business, I've slowly gotten a lot better with fundraising. The second business, because in each business has been pretty much back to back. I've never really given myself a time to relax, but the second business was straight off a failure. So I was a little embarrassed. I was a little, going to investor meetings with my tail between my legs, having to say I just failed. So it ended up being a really small friends and family round, like a couple $100,000. And then the third business, because there was a success around that second business, I had more confidence in myself, and I just fundamentally had learned enough to become a better entrepreneur in general. Where that third business, I was really confident in fundraising, and I at the time it was when raising money through syndicates off of AngelList was super popular in the Bay Area, and I had a successful raise through AngelList, which then promoted us to kind of global venture capital funds who then I was able to capitalize on. So that was a lot bigger raise on the third fund.
Outside of fundraising, what were kind of the evolution of your thought process on starting businesses in each one? Like, what were some of the takeaways from business one that helped you do business two to business three?
Well, it's just kind of going back to some of those problems that I now had hindsight on what did I do wrong in that first business and how can I get better? Whether it's, okay, let's make sure that, I'm not going to be a sole founder on that second business. I need a technical partner. So, by that second business, I had been an entrepreneur for a handful of years, and I had grown my network to, start that second business with at least one more founder, because doing a business alone as a sole founder is super hard. I was making quicker decisions. I was a lot more confident and could articulate why the business was going to be interesting for an angel investor to invest in. I was able in these the future businesses to actually get to market with a working product that was making some money. So by the time I had that first investor meeting, I had already de-risked the business by launching a product and making money.
So you've had a couple of successes in Silicon Valley, and you said earlier you wanted the excuse to come back to Colombia. Mm-hmm. How did you choose this business as the one to start?
So the founders and myself, there's three founders, me, Felipe Betancourt, and Angel Celis, and we had all previously worked on businesses together. And so all the past businesses, I've always outsourced a big chunk to Colombia because I was biased and because I knew one day I was going to be back. And I knew that when I came back, I wanted to have an army of people to choose from. And so as I progressed my career in the Bay Area, I enjoyed working the most with Felipe and Angel, and I knew that the three of us knew that the next business was going to be the three of us. And so in 2015, again, I had some free time to start traveling down to Bogota, and it just started with trying to get my records and understanding more of my roots. And on those trips, the three of us started to throw ideas against the wall. And one particular idea, which eventually ended up being Liftit, was, especially for myself, coming from the U.S., landing in Bogota, what is really obvious, at least to me, was the amount of trucks that are on the road. There's a ton of trucks here in the city. If you go to a local home goods store, like a home center, there's trucks lined up trying to solicit work. And around that same time, there were other marketplace products working and doing really well here in the city. Domicilios, Rappi, Tapsi, Uber, and the three of us saw an opportunity to try to attack the truck space with the marketplace application.
And so, what were some of the advantages besides being biased about Colombia of choosing Colombia as a place to have dev work done previously?
Well, the costs of getting that dev work done, and so it wasn't just Colombia. I had a lot of developers I'd work with in the Ukraine and Belarus, and so I had always tried to find pockets of interesting areas that you could outsource a part of the work for a fraction of the cost being in the Bay Area. And so basically, you also look for where is there a tech market that's growing. And you're not taking, the cost of labor can be cheap, but you also want to make sure that the workforce that you're recruiting has some experience and knows what it is to be an entrepreneur in a tech startup.
So one of the things that you see a lot in the U.S. is that outsourcing is sort of almost a dirty word for startups, especially startups that are trying to raise money. But having a second office offshore is becoming more and more common, and I believe it's going to be like almost table stakes for startups in the next couple of years.
Totally.
So can you talk about what that looks like and why maybe Latin America is more interesting than in Eastern Europe or not?
I think both markets are really interesting. And again, it kind of just comes back to my bias of wanting to help out the area where I'm from. But there's a ton of similarities. Both markets locally here in Bogota or Belarus, Ukraine, they have really interesting ecosystem, and the cost of labor is super cheap. So I don't think there's like any drastic differences except when it comes to myself, being biased of wanting to help out Colombia.
And the time zone.
And the time zone thing, yep.
That to me is the most important one, because if you can have the same talent level in Eastern Europe or in Colombia or Mexico or Chile, Argentina, you're working more or less on the same time zones as the US.
Exactly.
So it just makes, at least for me, it makes it a lot easier for that to actually work when you're not having to have your CTO waking up at 4 a.m. or
Exactly.
have your team waking up and staying in the office really late.
Yeah.
It seems to me to be more sustainable.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's a point I overlooked, but definitely an obvious advantage of working locally here in the U.S. because of the time zone.
And what were some of the other ideas that you guys threw against the wall that either didn't work or decided not to do because you just decided it wasn't a good idea?
There's a handful. One in particular that I remember. I had just around that time I had just had my a baby, and there was a subscription baby service. Whether it was like around toddler clothes or Legos for toddlers. There's a few of those businesses in the U.S. that were working really well. And we had some ideas of trying to apply it locally here in Bogota. But just one, like the other two founders had no connection to it. They're a lot younger than I am. They didn't have any children. And I think the market here wouldn't really allow for that because of the big disparity between incomes and just the culture itself. And so we saw that, talking to people, talking to other entrepreneurs and potential investors around some of these other businesses, that they just wouldn't be interesting and sustainable. But with Liftit, for all of the businesses, actually, we actually did do some tangible testing to see if the business was going to work or not locally. So with Liftit, we created just a Facebook page. And we put a picture of the other two founders holding up a couch and putting it onto a truck, and we put a marketing message around it, like, get your big bulk items like a couch or refrigerator delivered same day. And we spent $5 a day on that ad or promoting that picture. And on that first day, we had 3 requests from random B2C customers here in the city looking for a truck on demand. And then the next day, we had more requests, and the next day, even more. And so it was clear since day one that there was something around trucking in Bogota. And in the beginning, we had no tech, we had no truck drivers, we had nothing. We just tested the idea through Facebook and started to make money right away. And just for the first couple of months, all we used was WhatsApp and Facebook to execute on Liftit.
So can you talk a little more specifically about those steps? Because that's one of the things that I think a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in LATAM, maybe don't get yet. Because the generation is maybe 5 years ago of entrepreneurs, I think they understood that you had to do that because there wasn't the venture capital in LATAM that there is now today. Yeah. Even though there's still way less in LATAM than there should be. Yep. There's kind of this next generation that's seen companies like you, like Rappi, like Corner Shop, the neobanks in LATAM, and they think, well, I should just go out and raise a huge round to start. But if you actually dig into the vast majority of those companies, they all started with a similar story.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit, like maybe after you did the first Facebook ad, and how did you find the first truck? How did you make sure that there was good customer service? Did you talk to the people, like kind of that sort of stuff from the very early beginning?
Yeah, so you had a couple of questions mixed in there. Like the first was getting to market really simple. And I think, this was one of the first mistakes I had with my first business, Enthuse. The sports startup that failed. And so I took 14 months to fundraise, and in that time I really didn't have anything to show. I always was like, I eventually made a pitch deck, and I eventually had like some really sloppy technology that no one was really using to try to fundraise. But I realized that, man, I wasted a ton of time and opportunity fundraising when I didn't have anything to show. And so, obviously that was 2008, 2010 when the times were different. But now I think it's just table stakes to have a product launch and to be making a little bit of money to show that you can execute as a CEO and an entrepreneur and de-risk the business a little bit and have something to say around the business. And so, and it's not specific to Latin America. Like there's a bunch of entrepreneurs in the US as well who, everyone has a big vision. They have these huge ideas of how they're going to conquer the world. But you can, in the very beginning, you can boil that down to like one specific thing to let you know if this is going to be an interesting business to pursue. And for us, the vision of Liftit is to make logistics simple in Latin America. But in the very beginning, we just will anyone in Bogota order a truck on demand? And let's do that through like the most simplest way, which is Facebook. And so, we could have started with motorcycles or cross-docking bodegas or things around the ports of Colombia, but we wanted to start simple with trucking, and we thought that we could execute that really simple through a Facebook page. And so I think that's really important for feedback for an entrepreneur is, we all have big visions, but how can you test that your hypothesis really simply in the beginning for a low amount of money?
So talking about de-risking, there's sort of, you can think of it as an onion, right? You're peeling off one layer of the onion to de-risk each one.
Yeah.
What were some of those kind of waypoints or layers of the onion? You did the first one, which was the Facebook ad. What were some of those next ones along the line to saying, this is a real business, we're going to do this?
Yeah. Well, I can kind of bring back a previous question I didn't answer yet was, how did we get those first trucks? And so on the first day when the 3 orders came in, Felipe, one of the founders, ran out on the street and started to just grab random guys and say, hey, can I jump in your truck with you and go to Home Center to pick up a grill for this person? And so we started to, and we had previously, before we started the business, we did market research and we talked to truck drivers, but this was our first time where we're going to be in a truck with the driver and learn about the business. Like, what's it going to be like a day in the life of a truck driver in Bogota? Because before this business, none of us had any idea what that was like. None of us were truck drivers in Colombia. And so in those first few months of being in the truck, of doing the deliveries, we understood of what is the real pain points of the customer, what's the real pain points of the truck driver.
Interesting. And so what was that inflection point where you guys were saying, okay, this is looking like we've got some traction, it's time to raise some money?
Well, we were in a fortunate position where I was able to initially fund the business through the fund that I have, Bass and Ventures. And so that gave us, and I didn't do that right away. We continued to test the idea in the beginning. As I said, like the first couple of months was just through WhatsApp and Facebook. But it was really obvious there was something there. Every day there was more and more requests. And we were really fortunate in the beginning, to have a meeting with the Home Center Board of Directors, which is a local home goods store locally here. I think it's the biggest home goods store. And we learned that doing last mile delivery for them was a huge problem. So we didn't actually start working with them in the beginning, but we were talking to the big corporations here that hearing that last mile truck delivery was a big problem. So we were like, okay, like we could scale beyond B2C in the beginning and move to B2B. So these were some of the things that we discovered early on.
When you decided to expand outside of Colombia, what was your thought process, and how did you choose the countries to expand to?
So, there's definitely a good argument of staying focused in Colombia, doing a good job locally for a long period of time. Especially in trucking, in logistics, there's a ton of money that can be made in this space. Specifically for us, we were raising our second round of funding. We can get into the story around our seed round with Liftit, but we were coming into the Series A round for Liftit, which was early last year, and just doing preliminary discussions with investors outside of Colombia, we saw that people wanted to see that we could replicate the model outside of Colombia into bigger markets, for them to really get interested to do a large Series A, which was always in our plan.
And so going back to the raising money, let's walk through how you've raised. You have an interesting story that is probably not so typical to Latin, where you've had local money, you've had angels, you've had family offices, you've had U.S. money. What did those rounds look like, and how did you decide who to have invest?
Yeah. So as I said, we were fortunate that I put the first money in through Bass, and it wasn't like a huge check, but it was enough to get us going. I relocated to Bogota January 7th, 2 years ago, so I just passed my 2-year anniversary here. And I wanted to prove that I could come to Bogota and raise locally. I could have raised from friends, other entrepreneurs who have side funds in San Francisco, but right away I knew that it would be nice to have money in the bank, but those funds in the Bay Area couldn't help me locally with trucking in Bogota. Plus, I wanted to prove that I could move here and create a business, not speak the language, and raise from a market that a lot of people in the beginning were like, you're going to have a lot of time. The market is new and still getting used to angel investing, so you're going to have a difficult time fundraising. And I wanted to take on that challenge. And so I landed here 2 years ago, and the first day I started to fundraise locally. And I've always, even to today, LinkedIn is a great tool where here I am in a new country, in a new city. I don't know anyone, but I can find out who I'm supposed to meet just through LinkedIn. You do a kind of a quick filter, Bogota investors, and it shows me like the top 20 people I have the most connections with. And I just start there. And I find a way to get a warm introduction. So out of those 20 potential people, maybe I get a warm intro to 2, and then I'm off and running with fundraising. I can start with those 2, and then use that as leverage to get those next meetings and the next meetings. And so basically the whole first year, I was spending a lot of time fundraising, and at times I was fundraising almost 100% of my time because no one knows me. I'm trying to learn about the local ecosystem, and the ecosystem is young and don't necessarily know what it's like to invest into a safe. And so you have to have multiple meetings to explain and dig a little bit deeper for those angel checks. And so that first round of funding was primarily a lot of local angel investors from Colombia.
What was the biggest difference from raising in Latin America and in Colombia compared to the US?
There wasn't like an incredible amount of differences. You just locally had to spend more time educating the market, whether it's explaining why I don't have budgets and discounted cash flow analysis to support the pre-money valuation, or what is a safe and why is that different from a convertible note or an equity round. But I had that struggle in 2017, but the market here locally has become really strong in a short amount of time. So I'm pretty confident that if a new entrepreneur starts a business, they're not going to have the same struggle that I necessarily did just 2 years ago, but it was something I had to spend quite a bit of time overcoming in my first couple of months of fundraising locally here.
So you raised first from locals, then for the next round, what did you do?
So Colombia has an amazing investor ecosystem for a seed round. There's a lot of family offices, a lot of angel investors, and there's some local VC funds that are doing some seed investing. But beyond that, it's pretty much a dead end. There's no true Series A capital locally, and I knew that. I heard that before I got here. I experienced it firsthand fundraising, and so we immediately knew that we needed to start raising outside of Colombia. And so if you look at the round we just did, we actually did get a pretty good big check locally from a group, but most of that round came outside of Colombia. So we went to the obvious large markets around, which starting with Mexico. And I used that as an excuse to actually move there myself about in May of 2018 to launch business there, which de-risked the business for Series A investors, but also to start fundraising from VC funds out in Mexico, because I heard initially that there was funds out there that could write big checks. And so I moved out there personally to launch business and to fundraise and to start our Series A efforts.
I think Mexico has the most 70 million plus funds of anywhere in LATAM. And I think Brazil is number 2, and then Chile now has a couple. What did you see difference? What were the differences when you went from the ecosystem here in Colombia to the ecosystem in Mexico?
Yeah. So there, a lot of investors will, if you're coming from a different country, they'll initially tell you, sounds really interesting, but we'll get even more interested once you're here and making money locally. So on my first trip out there, I had never been there before, and used my LinkedIn strategy to start meeting with investors out there, because that's another market where when I first got there, I knew absolutely nobody. But I was able to get those warm connections and get the ball rolling with investor introductions. But basically everyone said, super interesting business, trucking, last mile trucking, really interesting, but talk to me when you're actually making money locally. And so what ended up actually happening was, when I relocated there myself, we hadn't really necessarily made money right away, but the investors saw that I was really serious about expanding the business, and I was serious as the CEO to raise money locally there in Mexico. So we didn't even, it took us a few months to make money in Mexico, but in those few months, investors saw that, again, that we were serious about expanding the business, which was good enough for them to get excited to then start committing to the round. So Mexico is a little bit more like the U.S. with fundraising, in my experience, where they're more educated in the space, and they're used to writing larger checks and making quicker decisions. They don't necessarily nitpick on every item there. So what the biggest difference that I saw is we were able to get quick decisions with investors in that market.
And so going back to the business, why is last mile delivery an interesting macro problem in LATAM? Generally for people from the US that are listening to this, why maybe have seen that you get the real-time tracking in the US on trucks, or you have a small window, you've got UPS that's dropping stuff off on specific days, you can do tracking, all that sort of stuff. What's it actually like here for last mile delivery, and why is it such a big problem to solve?
Yeah, well, globally on a macro level, last mile delivery and trucking is pretty hot. Like especially around last mile delivery, I think I wake up every morning and someone's forwarding me a really whether it's Europe, Asia, US, or LATAM, like just tackling logistics and last mile delivery is a huge problem. And a lot of people are talking about it. Specifically, why it works really well for Liftit is when you look at the truck market in Latin America, most of the truck market is owned by independent truck drivers. So the marketplace model works really well. Where I'm not convinced that this this product and this business would work exactly the way it works here in the U.S. Because in the U.S., the independent truck driver market is pretty much zero. But here it's opposite. In Colombia, it's 70% of the market is independent truck drivers, and they own the truck. So the Colombia family buying a truck is a huge investment for the local family, and so they're looking to. This is the way the family is going to make money for the next decade or more. Sometimes uncles and cousins will chip into this investment because they want to make money from it as well. And whether it's here in Mexico, it's 80% of the market, it's independent drivers. And so when you look at Liftit in the marketplace for trucking, that's one fundamental reason why in Latin America this model works really well.
Very interesting. And so there's a trend of, if you look at many of the top founders and companies in LATAM, many of them are either Latin Americans that went and studied in the US or grew up at least a chunk of their lives in the US and then came back, or they're people from the US that ended up moving down. What have you seen? Can you comment on that trend, and what do you think is maybe working there?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little sad because I am Colombian myself, and so when you look at the local market, I've definitely seen firsthand that myself, having grown up in the United States, walking into and pitching my idea to an investor, they're more likely going to write me a check than a local, another Colombian who's grown up here his entire life. So I say it's sad because like the local market is more, as it relates to investing, at least up until today. I do see this changing a little bit, but up until today, their local investors are more likely to put instant trust into investing into a foreigner rather than a local entrepreneur. That worked really well for myself, but it also was a fact that I had previous experience. I didn't flinch when I was talking about the initial pre-money valuation. It's because why this pre-money? It's because this is what I've done before, and I'm confident that I can build a big business, and that's the end of that discussion. Where the local entrepreneur here doesn't necessarily have that experience to pull from, and so those are the little things that help a foreigner who has especially been has done other startups do really well here, or be able to raise money a lot more faster than a local entrepreneur.
So one of the things that we see is that there's really talented people all across the region that aren't getting in LATAM that aren't getting the opportunity.
Yep.
If maybe you hadn't have gone to the US either to study or being adopted, your talent might have been either just used locally in a job. You might have not had the opportunity to see the ability to start a business, and now that's just sort of getting started in LATAM.
Yeah.
So do you see that changing, and how do you think it might change over the next 3 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think one way that can help a local entrepreneur is joining a startup. So in Bogota, there's a handful of really interesting, fast-growing startups, and so now there's no excuse to have zero experience. You can join Rappi, Mercado, Mercadoni, Liftit. There's a lot of local startups that are just getting to that inflection point and are still really early. As they're still early as a company, where you can get in early and learn. And so, I think Bogota and Colombia specifically didn't necessarily have that 5 years ago. And that's why that beginning ecosystem lacked investors and mentors and entrepreneurs who had been through it before, but that's no longer an excuse. And I think that's going to play really well into not only here, but into Latin America for the next handful of years.
I think joining a startup is a really good point, because startups generally talent plays. Yep. So if you're in the startup, you can go much, much faster than you would at a traditional business, and hopefully end up moving up, or potentially even starting your own thing down the road.
Yeah. And we're already seeing that here. We've lost a few employees that have gone and ventured off into their own, and we've seen them be able to raise locally pretty quickly, and they're a local entrepreneur based on being able to pull from the experience that they've learned here.
And so in terms of things for you learning, what kind of books, blogs, podcasts, documentaries, any of those do you like to recommend to people, either for entrepreneurship or just for life in general?
Yeah, for me, I focus on a lot of podcasts or a lot of videos online. I remember when I first started off, not even necessarily around the first business, but the second and third, and even now, I still will simply go to YouTube to type in Y Combinator, and even just focusing on that, like Y Combinator itself has a ton of information, whether it's their how to start a startup, where they have multiple classes where they share that with the public. And I've watched those videos over and over again. And from there, you learn who's presenting. Then you check out their blogs, you check out their podcasts. And there's a handful of really golden material online. And even to today, I really just focus there. And because my lifestyle, I'm traveling a lot. I'm always on the run. So sometimes where it's hard for me to sit down and read a book, you always have time to have something on in the background, whether you're cooking or brushing your teeth, you're in an Uber going to work, where you can listen and learn.
And so if you could go back to when you first started your first startup, knowing what you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
Basically going back to those issues that I have already described, and making sure I don't make those decisions. Like, spend the time. Like, don't start a startup by yourself. Like, for me personally, it's really hard to do this alone. So always have at least a technical partner to start with. Make quick decisions. Make sure you spend the time to recruiting and evaluating who's going to be a part of your initial team and beyond. So those are kind of fundamentally some of the things that I wish I didn't waste too much time in the beginning. And I personally put in a lot of my own money when I didn't necessarily have it in the beginning, where I was too extreme in that regard. And when that company failed, I ended up being in debt a lot of money, which was way too risky. So I kind of have a risky personality and character, but I didn't need to be that aggressive. Yeah.
So what advice would you give yourself if you could go back to 2 years ago when you first moved here full time?
I think I've done relatively pretty good. There hasn't been any major decisions where I was like, man, that was a really bad choice. The founders, we all worked together. I knew them well. We de-risked the business by starting really simple. I raised locally, which was definitely a great move. And, I had met with entrepreneurs who had previously are from the U.S. and previously done a business in the U.S. and raised money there, and then came here to do their business. But I think they ended up struggling because they don't have that local support. So, I think those were the decisions that I made. And a lot of them was, getting advice from local entrepreneurs here, but also leveraging on my experience, where those were really good decisions to help Liftit get to where it is today.
So what's next for you and Liftit, say the next year to 3 years?
So this year specifically, we have a really aggressive expansion plan. We just recently closed on a Series A round of financing that allows us to get to basically all the other markets, which we're already doing last mile trucking delivery in Brazil, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Mexico. But now expanding beyond those big cities in the country to other major cities, like in Mexico, for instance, to Monterrey and Guadalajara. So expansion, hiring, and continuing to prove out that we have a really good story around last mile trucking as we get into the next round of financing.
Thanks again for doing it. I wish you really well in the next year, and I'm going to be watching from the sidelines as you guys keep going, and hope you have a lot of success.
Thanks, Nate. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Brian York. If you like this episode on trucking and last mile delivery, be sure to check out my conversations with Federico Vega from CargoX and Miguel Torres from Shipify. I always appreciate any feedback on this podcast, so feel free to reach out on Twitter or LinkedIn by searching Nathan Lustig or via my website, nathanlustig.com. As always, if you like this podcast, please share it with a friend and give us a ratings on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Brian for hosting me at the Liftit office in Bogota, and to Angel and Sophia for helping produce this podcast. Most of all, thanks for listening and have a great rest of your day.